Hello and welcome to this SAP Business One training webinar on bank statement processing and bank reconciliation. My name is Kethan Solanki. Here's the agenda for today. So essentially we're covering the different methods of performing a bank reconciliation that are available in SAP Business One, which are the manual reconciliation process, which probably most of you are the most familiar with, the external reconciliation process, which is probably less common in Australia and in New Zealand for that matter. And then the final one is the bank statement processing, which allows you to do a level of automation with by importing a bank statement. So just going to quick overview of each one of these approaches before we move into the actual system and look at various options inside SAP. So the manual reconciliation process expects you to have a paper-based bank statement, and what you do is you go into the system, you enter in the balance, the closing balance of that bank statement, you put in the date, and then you start going in SAP. It'll give you a list of transactions that are not reconciled, and you start marking them off. That's the manual reconciliation process. The external reconciliation process also has an element of bringing in a bank statement. You can either import it, you can key it in, and then once you've got it in, you match it against the transactions. It exists in SAP, and there is some level of automation that you can perform. And then the final option, the one with the bank statement processing, this is the most involved, requires a good amount of configuration, but it involves creating some matching rules, importing the statement. Then the system performs the level of auto matching, and then finally, any exceptions you manage those, and then you finalize your bank rec. So let's start getting into the system. So the first, we're going to start by looking at the manual reconciliation option. So that would be found under under banking and manual reconciliation. Sorry, banking, bank statements, and external recs. And then under that, it's manual reconciliation. So in here, you need to select the bank account you're doing a reconciliation on. So let's say I'm going to pick my bank account there. It's telling me the last time I did a reconciliation, the bank balance was $843,762. I need to put in what the ending balance is on my current statement that I've received from the bank. So let me type that in. So 900,000, and I also need to enter in the date of the statement. So once I've done that and I hit OK, it takes me into the bank reconciliation screen. So in here, I can now start marking things off that are appearing in my paper-based statement. So let's say I've got that line, that line, that line, and that line. And the key point to note is to complete the bank reconciliation in this method, the difference here at the bottom needs to be 0. So until that point, if I attempt to reconcile, the system will stop me. It's giving me an error saying reconciliation is only possible when the difference is 0. Okay, so once I tick all the appropriate transactions, I get a 0, and I can then click the reconciliation button. Now, this method also allows you to do some additional adjustments. So in case you find something in your bank statement that does not already exist in SAP, which could happen if a customer has paid you and they haven't sent you a remittance, it could happen because the banks charged you some fees, or it could happen because they paid you some interest. So you can go in, click on the adjustment button, and then you get a few options. So you can either do it as a journal entry, incoming payment, outgoing payment. It could be a check, or it could be a deposit that hasn't been recorded in the system. So if I select the option journal entry, then it just sort of pre-populates the journal entry with the with the GL account, and then I can put the credit entry. Once I've done this, and if I click OK, what would happen is that transaction would get inserted into the reconciliation and already be marked as something that's been cleared. So once I'm happy with what I've done here, all I need to do is click on the reconcile button, and that will save the reconciliation for me. It's asking me if I want to enter a statement number. So this is something you can do. If you've got a reference for the statement, you can enter that in. Otherwise, you can continue without it. And that's it. That's done. So if I then come back and do another reconciliation for the same bank account, I can see it's showing the last balance was what I had already cleared, and then I can do another reconciliation to follow. Now, so once you've completed the reconciliation, you can also print the bank rec. So you can go into the banking reports, external reconciliation, and it's the bank reconciliation report here. So when you run that, you can see all the bank accounts. You pick the one you want to print the report for, and then you get a list of dates of recon that have been completed previously. So the one that we've just done is this last one here. So if I click OK, then what I get is a crystal report that prints out the reconciliation that I've just completed. So it shows me the beginning balance, what transactions have been cleared, what the ending balance is, and likewise from a GL account perspective as well. And then I also get a listing of those transactions that were cleared during the bank rec process. Okay, and it also shows you anything that's uncleared. And you can print this off and file it away, or you could come back into the system at a later date and just rerun this reconciliation, and you'll see the same information. Okay, so that's the first option, the manual reconciliation. The second option, which is the external reconciliation, there's a two-step process there. As I mentioned earlier, you need to enter your bank statement into the system, and there's a couple of different ways of doing it. So that bank statement entry screen is found under banking, bank statements and external reconciliations, and then it's the one that's called process external bank statement. Okay, and I click on that. Now, before actually we go into that, now this option here may not be visible in your system, and if that's the case, you just need to go into the form settings for your menu and make it active. Because it's not turned on by default, at least in the Australian and New Zealand localization. So there's a checkbox there, you'd have to turn it on. Now, the other thing to point out is that with bank recs, you need to pick a method and just use the same method always for a particular bank account. It's not recommended to change between various methods for the same account. So if you started with the manual rec, then stick with the manual rec. There may be a point where you may want to change, and yes, we can look at that, but you don't sort of switch between the various ones from day to day. So we'll go into the process external bank statement. So in here, you need to once again pick the bank account. And then what you see is a list of transactions that have already been reconciled, right? So these ones here have already been reconciled. But if I've got a bank statement, I can manually key in additional transactions in here. Or if I've got a file from the bank, I could also import that data into the bank rec. So I've set up an example here. So I've got 4 transactions and I've got some debits and credit amounts. I can just copy that, and this is just using the Excel copy-paste function that's been available in SAP for a little while now. I think it's probably since 9.1 or 9.2 possibly. So I can just go in here and I can just say paste. And it's asking me the question of whether the data that I've selected has got header information. In my case, it does, because I've got the date, debit amount, credit amount in the file definition. So if I say yes, those transactions get pasted in here. Now I could have had, other information in my data. I could have had details of the transaction. I could have had all sorts of additional information, and that could have been pushed through as well at the same time. Now, the other way of importing this data is through Data Transfer Workbench. That is also possible. But I mean, if you can do an Excel-based copy-paste, then you probably wouldn't want to spend your time preparing one of these files. So this is the template for importing these bank, the process external bank statement. This is the template. You can use that, you can prepare the file, and you can use Data Transfer Workbench to import the data. So just quickly show you where it'll be. Under import, it'll be a transactional data. It'll be add new data. And then it's under banking, bank statements and external reconciliations. And it's the option called bank pages. So you select that, and then you select the file you're importing. And then you can see the data, and then you can keep going and import it. I'm not going to import it, but I mean, this is sort of the steps if you wanted to import through Data Transfer Workbench. Excel copy-paste works just as well. So once you've got the data in, you've got to obviously save that. So this is step one of the bank rec process. So the first step is you bring the statement in. Then the next step is for you to go in and do the reconciliation. Now the reconciliation is done through this option called reconciliation, which is the external reconciliation process. And in here, you select the GL account you're doing. Now there's a few options here. You've got the manual, automatic, or semi-automatic options, and each one of those gives you some different capabilities, which I'll briefly run through. So what we'll do is start with the manual option. So we've picked the GL account, and we click reconcile. Then what you get is this view of those transactions. On the left side is the transactions that exist in SAP. On the right side are the transactions you've imported through your bank statement. Okay, and then what you do is you say, okay, well, that transaction there matches with that transaction. So you basically select that and select that. And once again, we're trying to get a situation where the totals on both sides are the same and there's no difference. So let's pick the next one. So let's say we match that one with that transaction. And you can either double click on the transaction to pull it down, or you can click on these arrows to pull them up or down. We'll do the same on this one here. So I'm going to grab that and grab that. And then we've got this additional transaction here, which matches with that. Right, so we reconcile, and then you just click the reconciliation button. And that will mark the transactions in the external bank statement as being fully reconciled. So I'll do that. I'll click the reconciliation button. And then if I come back to my external bank statement, if I reopen it, and you can see that those 4 transactions have been marked as reconciled, and they've got a reconciliation number 4. So once they've been marked as reconciled, these cannot be amended. Okay, so what else can we do on this screen? So the other thing we can also do on this screen is if we did have a transaction which you didn't have in SAP, but you had on the bank statement, where you can't really add that during the bank rec process, like we saw in the first option, right? In the first option, you could make those adjustments as part of the reconciliation process. With the external reconciliation process, you don't have that option. So if there is a transaction on your bank statement that doesn't exist in SAP, you'd have to go in and key it in manually before you can see it appear in the reconciliation process. So if I say, for instance, pick this transaction here. So it's 160,000 against Earthshaker Corporation. So it's an incoming payment to Earthshaker Corporation. Now, if I had that entry in the process external bank statement, let's say there's the date 30/12/06, and the amount was 160,000. I could go in and say create a payment. I could do that, and I could also then select a document number against which I would make that payment. So if I knew what the invoice number was, I could type that in. I could select the customer against which, and then if I clicked on update, it would automatically create that incoming payment for me. All right, so I'm not going to do that, but this is one way of creating a transaction that doesn't actually exist in SAP at the minute. If you've made a mistake with your bank rec, you can go and look at the manage previous external reconciliations. You pick the account, and you can find the reconciliation. There it is. And you can even cancel that reconciliation. And that reconciliation then disappears. So if I then go back into the external reconciliation, you can see those 4 transactions are back in play. They're still available to be reconciled because I have reversed them out. And if I went into the process external bank statement, and they're also now cleared and available to be reprocessed. So what we'll do now is look at the other 2 options when it comes to external reconciliation. So we've looked at the manual option. Let's look at the semi-automatic option. Now, when you turn on semi-automatic, you now get some additional options. You can say, what is the matching criteria? So we're saying, the amount, and you can assign different priorities to different criteria. So the only criteria you can use is amount. You can use the date, posting or due, and you can use the reference numbers on the transactions. And then you can either say it's a high, medium, or low priority. So then it sort of uses that criteria to allocate or match the transactions on both sides. So we're using the semi-automatic option, and if I go into the reconcile screen now, you can see the transactions. You can select on one side, and if I double click on it, then if there is a proposed matching, it will show it up. And in this case, it's showing, well, there's 2 potential matches. Which one do you want to match to? you can select the appropriate one, and then you can click on reconcile. So the final option is the automatic option. And with the automatic option, you got the either matching by totals or totals with restrictions, and then you can still do the different rules for auto matching, and the system will try and match as many as it can. So that's the external reconciliation. So key points to note, if you find something during the reconciliation process that doesn't exist in the system, you have to manually key the transaction into SAP before you can continue with your rec. Whereas with the manual reconciliation, you can identify or enter additional transactions as you go. So that's one of the key differences between the two. And in terms of printing the bank rec, it's the same screen as the manual reconciliation process. All right, so now let's look at the option of bank statement processing, which is the final option. Now, with bank statement processing, there is a good amount of configuration that needs to be done before you can use it. So one of the first things you need to do is under administration, system initialization, company details. There is an option under basic initialization called install bank statement processing. Now, please note that this is a one-way initiation. So if you turn this on, you cannot turn it off. So do not turn this on in your live system unless you're certain you wanna use it and you understand how it needs to be set up and so on. Right. So please bear that in mind before you go off and switch this particular option on. So the whole idea behind bank statement processing is you've got a file from your bank. It's already defined in a certain way. It's got transaction codes that map, and let us know what type of transaction each one of those lines represents. So whether it's a whether it's an incoming payment, whether it's outgoing payment, whether it's a payment from it's a fee, it's interest, whatever it is. There's predefined transaction codes, and that helps us map those transactions back into SAP. So let's look at firstly some of the setup that needs to be done under the administration setup, banking and banks area. One of the first things you need to do is define, once you turn on bank statement processing, these 3 additional columns appear. These 4 additional columns appear actually. And what you need to do is define what the default date is when you do a reconciliation from a transaction that has been imported through the bank statement processing. And the options are, it's either the statement date, the row date, the due date, or the current date. One of those needs to be selected for each one of these types of date values: posting date, due date, and document date. And as well as there's this other setting called bank operation code list. This also needs to be defined and imported. So once you've done that definition, you've got to also set up your house bank accounts. And in the house bank account definitions, there's some additional columns, once again, that become visible. So these are to do with the numbering sequence that will be used for the transactions that get generated via the bank statement processing. So if you're creating a journal, which numbering sequence do you use? And if you leave these blank, then it just uses the default numbering sequence. And it's only really relevant if you have more than one numbering sequence for these 3 transaction types. And then you've got to check the box to say, I'm importing a bank statement. And then you also need to define the file format that you're going to use for your bank statement import. So the file itself it's got to be configured or mapped and then assigned against against the house bank account. And you can have various different file formats. So some of the standard ones around the place are BAI2. There's another one called MT940. So and the issue here we've got in Australia and New Zealand for that matter is each one of those banks has their own slightly different variation of those standard file formats. So there isn't a countrywide standard format for these bank statements. But to import a bank statement, one of the critical pieces is to do the mapping of the files. So that is done via this tool called the Electronic File Manager Format Definition. So this is where we do our mappings, and I'll just open up one that we've, as an example. So this one's an example of one for Commonwealth Bank. And what you'll see is that when you're defining these mappings, you can have various definitions. So you can say whether the source file is an XML or a text file. And then once you've sort of defined that, then you define the format of the file, what information is sitting in which specific location of the file. You can have things like, is this file separated by commas? Is it separated by tabs? What sort of rules? So you got to define the structure of your source file, and then you got to map that onto the actual bank statement file. The bank statement format or data structure back in SAP. And so if I open up a file that we've done for the same CDA, you can see here, it's a lot of, it's not very easily read as a human. But you'll notice some of these codes here. So so you got 699, which possibly is a payment coming, money coming out of your bank. 699 again. There's a 399 here, which represents money coming into the bank. Another 399, and so on. So all these different types of transaction codes need to be mapped back into SAP as well. So firstly, you got to bring the data into this SAP file, the bank statement structure. And once you've done that, and once you've done your mapping, the next thing you need to do is define those. So back in administration and under bank statement processing, you got to define a couple of things. One is the internal bank operation codes, and the other is the external bank operation codes. Now, these things help us map the data from the file back into SAP. Okay, so what we'll do is firstly, we'll look at the internal bank operational codes. So here you can have, okay, these are the types of transactions we're going to have coming through relating to our bank accounts. So we might have some bank charges, we'll have bank fees, we'll have receipts from customers, we might have payments to suppliers, we might have some fees, we might have some interest, and all of these things need to be defined firstly. And then you got to say, well, when I do find one of these types of transactions in the mapping, and there's a few different ones here again, is it a GL account from to bank? Is it a business partner payment? Is it an interim transaction? Is it an external reconciliation? Do we ignore this type of transactions? There's different options. And then from there, you got to sort of say, then what sort of transaction is it going to post once you've selected that particular option? And then there's some narration about the expected results. So this is basically defining the types of transactions that we expect relating to cash inside SAP. That's our internal bank operating codes. Then we've got the external ones. Now the external ones is saying, well, if I've got a particular transaction code in my bank statement file from the bank, how does that map to the internal transaction? So we've defined the different internal transactions. Now we're mapping the external transactions. So if you remember when we were looking at our file format or the sample file, you could see that, for example, here's 699030. So that's one of these codes, which is an account fee. And you'll see 699030. We've got that defined as an account service fee, right? So this maps back to our internal code to the bank fee internal code. So that's how you build your mapping. You've got to map all the different transaction codes that exist from the bank. So the bank will provide these codes back to the transactions types that we want to have inside SAP. So just if I switch back into the internal bank operating codes, and one of the things you notice here is if it's a bank fee, for instance, what you can also do is then say, what is the GL account it's going to post to, right? So it's a bank fee, this is my bank fee GL account, and I want the GL transaction to map there automatically, right? So this is the beauty of doing all this work up front, because then when you start doing your bank rec, a lot of the hard work is already done for you. It's already doing all the postings and mappings for you. So if you remember this CBA, this here, the operation code, this is what you map to the house bank account. So our CBA account is mapped to this house bank account, and so, or rather, not there in the bank definition, we've got this bank operation code list. So we've got this CBA is linked to the CBA mapping. So once we've done that, the last thing remaining for us to do in our configuration or mapping is the matching criteria. So similar to what we saw in the external reconciliation, we've got the same thing with bank statement processing. And this one's a bit more detailed because you can have up to 3 rules and you can have up to 3 rounds. So what happens is in the first round, you'll have the most detailed mapping possible. So you might have all 3 rules defined. So I've only got 2 rules defined. I said the first rule is we've got to have the same amount and the difference needs to be less than 5 cents. Then I've got a second rule that says we're going to have to map on the posting date, and it's only plus or minus 2 days. I could have additional rules. I could have additional mappings. I may map based on, let's say, the supplier code or some sort of other reference number. So that's the round one. Then I might have a second round, and in the second round, I might sort of reduce, the matching criteria and say, as long as the amount balances, I'm happy, and I'll take that. And then you could have a third round as well. So you can define those different rounds. And then once you've done all that, then you come into the banking area and you go into the bank statement processing. Okay. And in here, then you can say import from file. So you can now pick the file that you've already previously defined and start doing your reconciliation. So I've got my file here, which is the BSP import file template, which the one that we looked at before, this one here. So now I'm going to import this file into the bank statement processing. Right, so it's sort of saying, yep, I've found 7 records in the file and I'm successful. And there it is, it's imported it. Now it's sitting as a status of draft. I can double click on that row and now I can see what it's done. So the data in our file, the same file that we were looking at before, is now imported into SAP, and formatted, and the data has been inserted into the correct columns. So what happens next? So the next thing we need to do is start reconciling. So because we've defined our rules, the first thing we do is here, we go and say, create posting proposals for uncleared rows. So the system will try its best to match these transactions to match the transactions in the bank statement back to the transactions in SAP. So I click on this now. It's performed some level of matching. So those first two transactions were bank fees, and so they've already been matched. The next transaction here was a customer receipt for $30, and it's found two potential transactions that match, right? Now it's saying, well, I don't know which one to match to, but it has to be one of these two. So you can then go in and say, well, okay, I want to match, and you can read the description here. It says, oh, this is saying Maxitech. Well, that means that it must be relating to the first line there, so I can tick that. Now, if you had some additional mapping criteria that said, if the customer code matches, then, auto match, then it would not have returned the second line in here. But it all depends on how detailed your mapping criteria is and how well you've mapped the file. The other thing to point out is you can also just come in here and enter an additional line, or you can just key in your bank statement as well. You don't have to import it, but you wouldn't get a lot of gain out of that. You might as well just use the external reconciliation or manual reconciliation process in that case. We can also look at this line here. We can see that there's a level of auto matching that's happened on these two transactions, so I can tick that. And then it hasn't really found anything else. So if I wanted to then say, well, okay, well, this one here, it hasn't found any mapping. So what do? I have to now manually match the ones that it couldn't automatically map. So to do that, I basically open up this line, I double click on it, and now it's bringing me another screen where I can do some additional matching myself. So I can go in and add open documents. So I can say, let's just look at all the open documents in the system. I can also filter it based on some criteria if I wanted to. All right, and then I click OK. And then when I click OK, it returns all the transactions it found that matched the criteria that I've selected. Now I can go in then and say, well, actually, this customer has paid this invoice and they've paid it partially. So I can tick that and I can say I'm going to reconcile this for 6 to 61.05 and click Update and click OK. And now that's brought that information back and it's marked that particular line as reconciled. And once I've done that, I can save this as a draft and come back again. And then once I've got mappings for everything, I click on the finalize, and that then closes that particular statement off. And the bank reconciliation is completed. And in terms of printing the bank rec, it's back at the same place which we've done in the first step. So the actual bank reconciliation printing doesn't change. Okay, so that concludes the webinar. Thanks everyone for attending.